That was Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell speaking on the Senate floor, announcing that he'll be stepping down as Republican leader in November. McConnell is the longest-serving Senate leader in American history. He says it's been the honor of his life and the highest privilege, but that it's time to move on to life's next chapter. Despite stepping down from his leadership role, he says he'll continue in the Senate and finish the job the people of Kentucky elected him to do. Let's bring in ABC's Jay O'Brien on Capitol Hill for more. Jay, given the back and forth and the recent shift in the Republican Party, how significant is this?
It's incredibly significant, Diane. I mean, if you think of the stamp that Mitch McConnell has left, not just on the history of the United States Congress, not just on the history of the Senate, but on American history in and of itself, losing his voice in the Republican Party is extremely significant. So think about what Mitch McConnell has done here. Firstly, his legacy is defined by his reshaping alongside former President Trump, then President Trump, of the federal judiciary, confirming conservative justices and stacking the federal judiciary with conservative justices. The Supreme Court, he holds open the nomination for Justice Scalia's replacement, remember, during President Obama's last few months. And that's how you end up getting not Justice Merrick Garland, who's now the Attorney General, but instead Justice Gorsuch. And the list goes on. He also was a vocal member here on Capitol Hill of continued support for Ukraine. He referenced that in his remarks just moments ago, in which he said, he talked about America's role in the free world. And he said, quote, "I know the politics in my party," referring to the fact that some Republicans are in opposition to funding Ukraine in its defense against Russia. But McConnell underscoring there how vital he believes Ukraine's struggle is for the future of the free world. And so losing his voice on those issues in Republican leadership will be very significant for Senate Republicans. He's not leaving the Senate, as he indicated in those remarks, but he has been leading Senate Republicans for quite some time. Again, he is the longest-serving leader in the United States, in the history of the United States Senate. So his voice not in the room, as it has been for decades on those issues, is going to have a very significant impact on Republicans' trajectory in the Senate and, frankly, in the United States Congress going forward.
Jay, what's next from here? What are you hearing about his plans after stepping down, and who could possibly replace him?
So again, it indicates from his remarks that he won't leave office, meaning he'll continue to serve the remainder of his term as the senior senator from Kentucky. He just won't be in Senate leadership anymore. That transition is going to be very interesting to watch because McConnell has had an iron grip on Republicans in the Senate for really his entire tenure. He has been known for years as a keen tactician, someone who knows how to use his power as a leader of Republicans in that chamber to exert his will and how to get things done. We know that there are already some Republicans who have lined up to replace McConnell because the question has been out for quite some time as how long he would serve in his role as leader. John Thune, the #2 Republican in the Senate, is a name that's getting thrown around a lot. John Barrasso, the #3 Republican in the Senate as well. John Cornyn is another name to keep in mind. By the by, those individuals, at least 2 of them, perhaps all 3, I noticed there on the Senate floor shaking Mitch McConnell's hand as he ended those remarks. John Thune was the very tall gentleman. You saw John Cornyn's white hair there on the Senate floor as well. So there will be a race amongst Senate Republicans as to who will be Mitch McConnell's successor. And it will likely expose some divisions amongst Senate Republicans that we've frankly already seen, Diane. Some more hardline Senate Republicans have made a show in recent years of showing that they do not believe McConnell shares their point of view. They do not believe he is as conservative as they are. And there was even an attempt when Republicans took control of the House and there was a reshaping in the Senate of ousting McConnell from his leadership role. That was unsuccessful. It was not expected to succeed when it happened. But you can expect those hardline conservatives like Rick Scott also to play a role in who McConnell's successor will be and be very vocal as that process plays out.
Jay, what sort of legacy is Mitch McConnell leaving behind as Republican leader?
I think there's three elements to his legacy that come to mind right now. The first is what you and I discussed, which is the reshaping of the federal judiciary, the confirming of conservative justices, the reshaping of the United States Supreme Court that has led to those tectonic shifts in American politics, like the overturning of Roe and things of that nature. That court was fashioned by Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. And Mitch McConnell will tell you that is a central piece of his legacy, the judiciary. Another that has only come up in recent years is funding for Ukraine in its defense against Russia. I had one lawmaker describe to me that they believe Mitch McConnell views that as a central pillar of his legacy, to try to arm Ukraine, again, in its defense against Russia and in the broader question of Ukraine's role in the free world. And then the third is something that is not of McConnell's making, which is how Mitch McConnell has stayed in his current role given the shifts in the Republican Party in the age of Donald Trump. In the early tenure of the Trump administration, or in Donald Trump's early tenure as president, Mitch McConnell worked with him on tax cuts and things of that nature. He was an ally of Donald Trump's in the Senate. And then, of course, as the Trump administration continued, it ended in January 6th in that attack on the Capitol. There was that very public break between Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, where Mitch McConnell was sharply critical of the president's actions that day, saying that the former president bared responsibility for that mob attack on the Capitol. Mitch McConnell, in sense, has not gone as far as some Republicans and certainly Democrats wanted to see from him in his rebukes of Trump. He did not vote to convict Donald Trump, for instance, in his second impeachment on the Senate floor. He said it was an issue of precedent. But certainly Mitch McConnell, you heard him talk about in his statement or in his remarks on the Senate floor that he was a Reagan Republican. And think of how much the Republican Party has shifted and changed while Mitch McConnell has worked his way up to the leadership in the Senate and then stayed in that role as the leader of Senate Republicans.
Now, Jay, this comes amid some growing concern over McConnell's health. He appeared to freeze while talking with reporters a few months ago. That happened on two separate occasions. So what do we know about his health right now?
So we know, I'll take you back to the summer. Those two instances of him freezing during press conferences occurred, one in July and one in August. The first was at a press conference here at the Capitol where he froze. He appeared to not hear a reporter's question, and he appeared to not remember where he was in his remarks, and he just stepped to the side and was then ushered back into his office. He did emerge later and say that he was fine. Then he had another incident freezing at a press conference and a media availability in Kentucky when the Senate was on recess. And that sparked, as you noted, Diane, a lot of questions about what Mitch McConnell's health picture was. Mitch McConnell's office gave a number of different reasonings for freezing, but one of them was that they said he was dehydrated and exhausted and things of that nature. He had just recovered from an illness at that point as well. His office said he had a public fall, remember, at an event here in Washington, D.C., too. So there was this specter of questions around his health. Now, Mitch McConnell in recent months has given interviews in which he said from those instances of freezing, he's fully recovered. He said he was fine. He said he's certainly willing and able to continue with the job. But in stepping down from leadership today, firstly, it takes a lot off his plate. Being the leader of Republicans in the Senate is not an easy job. And secondly, he did acknowledge that in his remarks, if I'm paraphrasing him correctly, Father Time always wins in the end. And he was essentially saying it's time for a new era of Republican leadership in the Senate.
Now, McConnell says he still has gas in the tank to surprise his critics. What do you think that means? What are you watching for in these last few months of his leadership?
Well, it's definitely a recognition of the fact that, A, he is going to serve out the remaining months until November as the Senate leader. You can expect him in those months to, A, reflect on his legacy, as he noted in those remarks, but B, continue pressure on his policy goals, one of which, as we have repeatedly discussed, is continued aid for Ukraine, which is still stalled right now in the Congress. Remember, the Senate passed a $95 billion foreign aid package that includes aid for Ukraine and for Israel. It was passed after a lot of work, frankly, on Mitch McConnell's behalf in the Senate. And then, of course, it gets sent over to the House where it's still currently stalled. Speaker Mike Johnson has indicated he's not going to put it on the House floor without some kind of border security provisions in it. If that sounds familiar, as you and I have discussed before, it is, because Mike Johnson has said that before. That's what kicked off bipartisan negotiations on the border in the Senate, the product of which Mitch McConnell championed and Mike Johnson ultimately rejected because he said it wasn't hardline conservative enough. So you can expect Mitch McConnell to continue to bring up this issue of Ukraine. Look no further, frankly, than that meeting that occurred in the White House yesterday between President Biden and the big four congressional leaders. We know from sources that Mitch McConnell was the lawmaker in that room amongst Democrats and the president who was making the hardest case to Speaker Johnson of the need to pass aid for Ukraine right now, of the urgency of the need for that aid, of the fact that Ukrainians are running out of armaments, running out of munitions, and losing in some instances to Russia on the battlefield. So expect Mitch McConnell to continue to bring that up.